It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind of night when the old maple trees outside whispered against my windows, and the only sound inside the house was the gentle creak of my rocking chair. I had lived in this home for more than 3 decades, and silence had become my closest companion since my husband passed. Yet, that night, the silence was broken by something far more unsettling. I watched from the shadows of my bedroom as Melissa, my daughter-in-law, tiptoed inside. Her hand trembled just slightly, but her eyes, those eyes, glistened with the kind of hunger that money breeds. She thought I was asleep, but I never sleep lightly, not anymore. Not with someone like her under my roof. She moved straight to my nightstand, as if she had rehearsed it in her mind a dozen times. With the slyest of smiles, she slid open the drawer and found the tiny brass key. I heard her whisper under her breath, "That old woman probably doesn't even remember where she keeps her things." Her voice carried a coldness that cut deeper than any knife. But when she finally opened the drawer further, her smirk faltered. Her face drained of color, as if she had seen a ghost. And me? I just sat there in my rocking chair, silent, watching, a faint smile curling at my lips. She thought I was just a clueless old woman. She had no idea I used to be a bank fraud investigator. When I look back at the winding path of my life, I often wonder how the years slipped through my fingers so quietly. My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. I live in the same old family house on Maple Street, the one that has stood proudly through storms, summers, winters, and countless birthdays. Its creaking floors and faded wallpaper hold memories of love, laughter, and loss. My husband, Thomas, passed away nearly a decade ago, leaving me with a silence that never quite left the corners of this home. Still, I stayed here, keeping every piece of furniture and every garden stone as a living museum to our years together. To neighbors, I appear to be nothing more than a frail old widow who drinks tea at dawn and tends to roses at dusk. But beneath the surface, there is more to me than meets the eye. For 25 long years, I worked as a fraud investigator for a major bank. Every morning, I would slip into sharp suits and walk through revolving glass doors with the determination of a hawk circling its prey. My job demanded meticulous eyes and unwavering patience. I learned to read people the way other women read recipes, every flicker of expression, every hesitation in speech, every clumsy lie disguised as a half smile. I grew familiar with the scent of deception, and I carried that skill like armor even after retirement. Yet, when you wear armor for too long, people around you start to believe you are invincible. The truth is, I was still a mother, vulnerable in the places that mattered most. My only son, Daniel, has always been the gentlest soul. At 29 years old, he still carries the same soft expression he wore as a boy, wide-eyed and trusting, as if the world could never betray him. When he was a child, I called him my little knight because he wanted to protect me even when his hands were too small to hold a sword. He believed in good intentions the way a preacher believes in faith. And while that made him kind, it also left him terribly blind. When Daniel introduced Melissa to me, I wanted to believe that she would cherish him. She was 27, with a polished smile and eyes that pretended to sparkle with sincerity. At first glance, she seemed perfect, polite, attentive, and eager to win my approval. She would compliment the house, insist on helping with dishes, and speak in a sweet tone that seemed almost rehearsed. But beneath that sugary exterior, I sensed a restless energy, like a fox circling a chicken coop. My instincts, sharpened over decades of catching liars and cheats, whispered that something about her was not quite right. Still, Daniel loved her. He saw in her what he wanted to see, not what truly existed. And because I loved him, I chose silence. It did not take long for the truth to unravel. Melissa carried more than just a suitcase into our home. She dragged in piles of credit card debt, impulsive habits, and a desperation for wealth that clung to her like smoke. She masked her insecurities with expensive dresses and shiny handbags, purchased on money that was never really hers. She wore charm like perfume, a thick layer meant to distract from the rot underneath. I had met women like her before in the fraud cases I handled, women who thought manipulation was easier than labor, who mistook kindness for weakness. When they moved in under the excuse of financial struggles, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that a mother's home should always have a door open for her child, no matter how old he is. But as the days turned into weeks, I noticed the subtle ways Melissa began to settle in, as if she were laying claim. She rearranged furniture without asking, criticized the old curtains that Thomas had chosen, and made passive remarks about how I managed my savings. To Daniel, it seemed like she was merely trying to help, but I recognized the pattern. She was testing boundaries, slowly tightening her grip on the household while wrapping herself in the disguise of care. One afternoon during lunch, her mask slipped. She looked up from her sandwich and asked in the most casual tone, "Mom Margaret, that jewelry box upstairs, is it well locked?" Her question sliced through the conversation like a knife. Daniel nearly choked on his bite, startled, while I kept my face calm, answering vaguely, "It's just an old box." But inside, my heart raced. She should not have known about the key. That knowledge was not given to her. It was stolen through snooping. At that moment, I knew my home was no longer safe. That night, as I sat alone in my rocking chair, I remembered all the criminals I had confronted in my career. I remembered how they underestimated me, how they thought an aging woman with gentle hands and silver hair could never outsmart them. And yet, I always did. Now, fate had brought a predator into my very kitchen, dressed as family. Melissa thought she had stumbled upon a feeble widow whose memory was fading with age. What she did not realize was that I had spent more than 2 decades dissecting lies for a living. Every fiber of my being was alert. The house that once felt like a sanctuary had become a stage for deception. Every whisper Melissa shared on the phone behind closed doors, every curious glance at my drawers, every too sweet smile, these were cracks in her performance. Daniel, poor boy, remained oblivious. He defended her with the kind of devotion that made me ache with both pride and sorrow. He believed her questions about my bank accounts and insurance were signs of concern, not greed. He believed her late-night restlessness was worry, not plotting. He believed in her because he wanted to believe in love. I wanted to protect him from the truth, but I also knew that protecting him meant confronting her. My heart was heavy with dread, yet my mind sharpened with resolve. A mother can forgive many things, but betrayal, under her own roof betrayal, that endangers her child's peace, that is unforgivable. I began to prepare myself, quietly, meticulously, the way I once prepared for undercover investigations. Only this time, the battlefield was not a bank office or a courtroom. It was my bedroom, my kitchen, my very heart. Melissa may have thought she was the predator, circling around an old woman too tired to notice. But I had already seen the wolf behind the sheep's clothing. And unlike the naive neighbors or her unsuspecting husband, I was not going to let her devour what little peace I had left. From that moment, the war inside my home began. There is a peculiar heaviness that lingers in the air when trust begins to fracture. It does not happen suddenly, like glass shattering in a single blow. Instead, it seeps into the spaces between words. It hides in glances that last too long, and it grows silently like mold in the corners of a house. That is exactly how it began with Melissa. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment the darkness settled into my kitchen, but I remember the first time her intentions spilled out too clearly for me to ignore. It was a Sunday afternoon, a simple family lunch with roast chicken and fresh bread. Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes bright as he spoke about some card game his friends had invited him to later in the week. I remember smiling at him, grateful for a moment of normalcy. Then, as casually as someone asking for the salt, Melissa turned her head toward me and said, "Mom Margaret, that jewelry box upstairs, is it well locked?" The words were smooth, almost too smooth, but they carried a sharpness that sliced through the room. Daniel's fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the plate, and he coughed mid-bite, as if the question had physically struck him. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, breathing evenly, though inside, my heart gave a startled jolt. That jewelry box was more than just a trinket. It held small heirlooms, pieces of my life tucked away, and most importantly, it was never something I had spoken to her about. "Just an old box," I answered softly, keeping my voice steady. I let the words hang in the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed out. Daniel recovered quickly, laughing awkwardly, trying to dismiss the tension, but I saw the way Melissa's eyes flickered, the way she studied me like a chess player studying her opponent's next move. She smiled sweetly afterward, complimenting the roast, but the question lingered in my mind long after the dishes were cleared. That night, as the house grew still, I walked upstairs and opened the drawer where I kept the key. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the confirmation of my suspicion. The drawer had been disturbed. I knew the rhythm of my belongings, the way each item rested exactly where I had placed it, and this time, something was off. The key had been touched. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the shadows on the wall, and I felt the truth sink in like a stone in deep water. Melissa was not curious, she was hunting. She had already crossed into a territory she should never have entered. And yet, I said nothing. Silence, in moments like these, is both weapon and shield. 2 nights later, as I passed by the staircase on my way to get a glass of water, I heard her voice. Soft, hushed, curling through the dark like smoke. She was on the phone, speaking in a tone I had never heard before, sharp, impatient, laced with greed. "She has plenty of money," she whispered harshly. "Tomorrow night, while Daniel's at poker, we'll have time." I froze in the shadows, clutching the wooden banister, the air in my lungs suddenly too heavy to exhale. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Her words were not ambiguous. They were not a misunderstanding. They were intent. She was planning to rob me. For a long moment, I remained hidden, letting the reality press down on me. My daughter-in-law, the woman my son trusted, had been circling me like prey. The betrayal cut deeper than any thief on the street ever could, because this one had been welcomed into my home with open arms. When she ended the call, I slipped back into my bedroom and closed the door quietly behind me. I leaned against the wood, letting my breath finally escape, ragged and uneven. The silence of the house no longer felt like safety. It felt like a trap closing in. Over the following days, Melissa's questions became bolder. She lingered by the kitchen counter, asking about my insurance policy with a tilt of her head, pretending concern. She made offhand remarks about how I must have saved a fortune after working so long at the bank. She even asked about my sleep habits, smiling innocently. "You must fall asleep so quickly, don't you?" As if she were gauging the best time to strike. Daniel, poor boy, saw none of it. He mistook her questions for care, her probing for attentiveness. He would laugh and say, "Melissa just worries too much, Mom. She wants to make sure you're comfortable." His innocence was both beautiful and infuriating. He wanted so badly to believe in love that he ignored the cracks widening right before his eyes. Each night, I lay awake in my bed, the ceiling looming above me, thinking of all the ways this could unfold. My mind, trained by years of unmasking frauds, mapped out the possibilities. I knew the steps she would take, the lies she would tell, the mask she would wear until it finally crumbled. I had seen it all before. But this time, the battlefield was not an office cubicle filled with files and case numbers. This time, the battlefield was my own home, and the stakes were the trust of my only son. The more I thought about it, the more my fear gave way to determination. I could not simply sit by and wait for her to strip away the little I had left. I needed to act, to prepare, to turn the stage she thought she controlled into a trap of my own making. And so, silently, I began to plan. The conflict had entered my home, but what Melissa did not know was that she had awakened a part of me that had never truly retired. The days that followed were painted in shades of unease. I moved through my house the way one moves through a museum at night, quietly, cautiously, listening for footsteps that should not be there. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of curtains, carried a weight it never had before. I knew that Melissa was circling closer, her intentions sharpening with every passing hour. And though Daniel remained blissfully unaware, I could feel the storm building behind her polished smile. One morning, I discovered that my nightstand drawer had been searched again. The key, my precious little brass key, was no longer where I had left it. My hands shook as I pulled open the drawer and saw the faintest shift in the arrangement of things. A button box sat half an inch farther back, the stack of old letters slightly uneven. It was subtle, so subtle that most would not notice, but my eyes, trained from decades of observation, caught it instantly. She had been there. She had touched what was mine. She had dared to treat my sanctuary as if it belonged to her. I closed the drawer slowly, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Rage rose in me like fire licking up dry wood, but I swallowed it down. This was not the moment to explode. This was the moment to watch, to wait, to prepare. Melissa thought she was invisible, that her sneaking went unnoticed. What she did not know was that I had already begun to weave a net, and every greedy step she took only tangled her further. That night, as I descended the stairs for a glass of water, I overheard her again. The house was dark, the only glow coming from the faint light of her phone. I paused on the staircase, my hand tightening on the railing, as her voice drifted upward. "She has plenty of money," she whispered harshly, her tone stripped of its usual sweetness. "Tomorrow night, while Daniel's at poker, we'll have time. You just need to be ready." The words landed in my ears like shards of glass. I could feel the betrayal in each syllable. She was not simply planning. She had already coordinated. Someone else was involved. My heart pounded so loudly I worried it might betray me, but I stayed hidden, letting her speak, memorizing every venomous word. When she finally ended the call, I retreated into my bedroom, shutting the door with the silence of a ghost. I leaned against it, my pulse racing. My mind was no longer clouded with doubt. The truth was as clear as day. She intended to rob me, and she believed she would succeed. The following morning, Melissa entered the kitchen with a smile that could have fooled an angel. She poured Daniel a cup of coffee, kissed his cheek, and spoke about dinner plans, as if her hands were not already stained with the intention of theft. I studied her from across the table, my expression calm, my eyes betraying nothing. But inside, I was cataloging every detail, every telltale flicker in her expression. I had spent years interrogating criminals who swore innocence with their mouths while their eyes screamed guilt. And Melissa was no different. Her questions grew bolder that week. She leaned casually against the counter one afternoon and asked, "Mom Margaret, do you ever think about adjusting your insurance policy? I mean, it must be a lot to manage at your age." She smiled as though her words were dipped in honey, but the bitterness was obvious to me. Daniel, sitting nearby, laughed lightly. "Melissa just worries too much, Mom. She wants to make sure you're taken care of." I smiled back at him, though it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. His innocence blinded him. He saw her concern as genuine, her nosiness as care. He wanted so badly to believe in her that he refused to see the wolf beneath her wool. That evening, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I had two choices: confront her openly and risk Daniel's disbelief, or wait for her to step fully into the trap she was setting for herself. I chose the latter. Patience had always been my weapon. I decided to let her walk straight into the fire she had lit. And so, I began to prepare. The first step was subtle surveillance. I purchased a small hidden camera, a device no larger than a button, and positioned it carefully inside my bedroom. Its lens pointed directly at the nightstand drawer, capturing the exact spot where Melissa's curiosity had already led her more than once. If she returned, and I knew she would, the camera would see her for who she truly was. The second step was more theatrical. I constructed a trap, a simple but effective mechanism designed to leave a mark that could not be denied. I filled a small balloon with thick red paint, the color of spilled blood, and nestled it carefully within the drawer, just behind the false panel. If Melissa reached for what she believed was the treasure, she would trigger it. The balloon would burst, drenching her in crimson, a stain she could not explain away. As I set my plan in motion, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt control returning to my hands. This house was mine, and I refused to let it be a hunting ground for someone else's greed. Melissa thought she was clever, but she had no idea that every step she took was one I had already anticipated. The night before Daniel's poker game, I watched Melissa closely. She floated around the house with an almost giddy energy, humming under her breath, her eyes sparkling with a dangerous kind of excitement. She believed her moment of triumph was near. She believed she would walk away with more than she deserved. I sat quietly in my rocking chair, knitting in my lap, and thought of all the years I had spent unraveling lies. Criminals always believed they were smarter than the system, that they could outwit the eyes watching them. But arrogance is the sharpest noose, and Melissa was already tightening it around her own neck. By the time Daniel kissed her goodbye that following evening and left for his poker game, I was ready. The house grew quiet after Daniel left that evening. I heard the door close, followed by the fading sound of his car engine as it disappeared down Maple Street. For a long while, I sat perfectly still in my rocking chair, letting the silence wrap itself around me like a cloak. My needles clicked softly against each other as I pretended to knit, though my mind was elsewhere, pacing back and forth with anticipation. Tonight, I told myself, the truth would step into the light. Tonight, Melissa would reveal herself, not just to me, but to the one person she could never fool again, my son. Melissa moved through the house with forced casualness, her footsteps too light, her humming too cheerful. She busied herself in the kitchen, wiping counters that were already clean, rearranging fruit in the bowl, as if waiting for some invisible cue. Every so often, I caught her glancing at me, her lips curled into a polite smile, but her eyes betrayed the restless impatience underneath. She was waiting for me to retire to bed. She wanted darkness, silence, and opportunity. I obliged her. At 10 o'clock sharp, I rose from my chair, stretched slowly as though weighed down by age, and told her I was heading upstairs to rest. She nodded sweetly, her voice lilting. "Good night, Mom Margaret. Sleep well." The words tasted false even as they left her mouth. I offered a faint smile and shuffled toward the staircase, careful to let my body mimic fatigue. But once inside my bedroom, I did not sleep. I sat in the shadows, the camera's tiny red light blinking unseen. My trap set, my heart pounding with the steady rhythm of resolve. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. I listened to the creaks and sighs of the old house, waiting for the sound I knew would come. At last, sometime past midnight, I heard it. The gentle turn of the doorknob, the soft push of the door easing open, my breath stilled in my chest as Melissa slipped inside, her figure a shadow against the dim glow of the hallway light. She hesitated only briefly, glancing toward my bed. I kept perfectly still, my breathing deep and even, feigning the slumber she expected. Satisfied, she tiptoed toward the nightstand, her movements rehearsed, confident. Her hand reached for the drawer, trembling slightly with anticipation. I could almost hear the greedy rhythm of her heartbeat as her fingers closed around the brass handle. She pulled. The drawer slid open with a soft groan. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then boom. The paint bomb exploded, a violent splash of crimson bursting across her face, her hair, her blouse. She gasped, stumbling back, a strangled scream escaping her throat. The thick red paint clung to her skin, dripping down her arms, staining her in the unmistakable color of guilt. I sat up slowly, my smile calm, my eyes unblinking. The rocking chair creaked as I leaned forward and whispered into the heavy air. "Looking for something, Melissa?" Her wide eyes found mine in the darkness, horror etched into every line of her face. I was just," she stammered, but the words crumbled under the weight of truth. Her hands shook, smeared with red, the evidence undeniable. Before she could form another lie, the sound of hurried footsteps thundered up the stairs. Daniel burst into the room, his eyes darting between me and his wife, his mouth falling open in shock. There she stood, drenched in crimson, the drawer wide open, the fake key clutched in her hand. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice breaking with confusion. Melissa spun toward him, desperation flashing in her eyes. "Daniel, it's not what it looks like. Your mother set me up." She reached for him with paint-stained hands, her voice frantic. I remained seated, my calmness, the sharpest blade in the room. Without a word, I reached to the side table and pressed play on a small recorder I had hidden days earlier. Melissa's own voice filled the silence, cold and unmistakable. "She has plenty of money. Tomorrow night, while Daniel's at poker, we'll have time." Daniel froze. The color drained from his face as the recording played on, revealing every word of her treachery. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the betrayal settled upon him like chains. Melissa's face contorted in panic. "That's not real. She's twisting this." But even as she pleaded, her eyes darted, searching for escape. Daniel's hands trembled at his sides. He looked at me, then at her, then back again, his mind grappling with the collision of love and truth. And then, slowly, the realization dawned. His eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, and I watched as the boy I had raised, the one who always sought to see the good, finally confronted the evil in front of him. "Get out," he said, his voice low, steady, and edged with fury. Melissa blinked, stunned. "Daniel, please, get out." His shout shook the walls, the final crack that split her mask in two. She stood there for a moment, dripping red, her chest heaving, before she turned and fled. Her footsteps pounded down the staircase. The front door slammed, and the house fell silent once more. Daniel stood motionless, his shoulders shaking. I rose slowly, walked to his side, and placed a gentle hand on his arm. He looked at me then, eyes brimming with both grief and relief. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly, my heart aching for his pain but grateful that the truth had finally been laid bare. In that moment, I knew the war inside my home was over. Melissa thought she had been the predator, but she had walked willingly into the trap of a mother's eyes, and she had lost. The night Melissa fled my house, leaving behind the echo of the slamming door, I sat in my rocking chair long after Daniel had retreated to his room. The paint stain still clung to the carpet, the acrid scent of it hanging in the air like an uninvited ghost. My heart was steady, but there was a hollow ache beneath my calm. I had won the battle, yes, but I could not help mourning the fact that the enemy had been someone I once welcomed as family. There is no victory in watching your child's trust splinter. The morning light spilled across the kitchen table, golden and gentle, but Daniel's face was pale and drawn. He sat across from me, nursing a cup of coffee he had barely touched, his fingers restless against the ceramic. His silence weighed heavier than any words. Finally, he looked up, his eyes red from a sleepless night, and whispered, "Mom, how could I not have seen it?" I reached across the table, laying my hand over his. His skin was warm, trembling faintly, like a boy lost in the storm of his own disbelief. "Because you wanted to believe in love?" I said softly. "There is no shame in that. Love makes us blind. But blindness is not weakness. It is proof that your heart is still pure." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "She called you a lonely old fool, Mom. She planned to steal from you right under my nose. And I defended her." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment he seemed younger, fragile, as though he had regressed to the boy who once clung to my skirt after scraping his knee. I squeezed his hand gently. "Do not blame yourself, Daniel. Wolves wear sheep's clothing for a reason. You trusted her because that is who you are. And though it hurts now, someday, you will see that trust is not a weakness. It is what makes you human." For the next few weeks, the house carried a strange quiet. Melissa had moved out swiftly, dragging her suitcases and debts into the arms of whoever would have her. Rumors rippled through the neighborhood, whispers about why Daniel's wife was suddenly gone, why she stormed out one rainy afternoon without looking back. People speculated, but I said nothing. The truth was ours to hold, and not every wound deserves to be displayed in public. Daniel tried to keep himself busy. He poured his energy into work, staying late at the office, volunteering for extra projects. But at night, when he returned home, I could see the fatigue etched into his features, the heartbreak he carried like an invisible weight on his shoulders. There were evenings when I heard him pacing in his room, his footsteps restless, his breaths uneven. Once, I found him sitting on the porch long past midnight, staring into the dark as though searching for answers the night sky would not give. I did not press him. Grief has its own timetable, and I knew better than to force healing before its season. Instead, I cooked his favorite meals, left fresh coffee waiting in the mornings, and sometimes I would simply sit with him in silence. Words were not always necessary. The presence of love was enough. Gradually, he began to change. The boy who once trusted too easily started to ask harder questions at work, to listen more carefully to the tones behind people's words. He began to recognize manipulation where he had once overlooked it. I watched as resilience grew within him, not hardening his heart, but tempering it, the way steel is strengthened by fire. One evening, he came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes and leaned against the counter. His voice was steadier now, touched with a quiet resolve. "Mom, I'm filing for divorce." I dried my hands and turned to face him, studying the determination in his eyes. He was no longer pleading for reassurance. He had made his choice, and though the decision pained him, it also liberated him. "I think that's wise," I said gently. "You deserve peace. You deserve someone who loves you without lies." He nodded, exhaling deeply, as though releasing months of pent-up tension. "I feel like I wasted years, but maybe it was a lesson I needed." I smiled softly, reaching up to touch his cheek the way I did when he was a child. "Lessons are never wasted, Daniel. Pain teaches us truths that comfort never could." In the months that followed, Melissa's shadow faded. She tried calling once, her voice dripping with false remorse, but Daniel hung up before she could finish her first sentence. He told me later that he felt nothing but relief in doing so. He no longer owed her his patience, his forgiveness, or his future. By spring, a quiet transformation had taken place in our home. Daniel found a new position at the bank, a role that challenged him and reminded him of his own worth. He spoke with a newfound confidence, his laughter slowly returning, warmer and freer than I had heard in years. Sometimes, when he sat across the breakfast table, his eyes met mine with gratitude that needed no words. He knew I had saved him from a life of deception, and though it hurt him to admit the depth of Melissa's betrayal, He also knew that we had come through it stronger together. For me, the house regained its peace. The shadows that once stretched across my walls no longer carried menace. I tended my roses again, their blossoms brighter than before, and I resumed my morning walks beneath the maple trees. The rocking chair creaked in rhythm once more, not with worry, but with the steady heartbeat of contentment. Yet, I also carried a deeper awareness. Betrayal leaves marks, even after the wounds heal. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I replayed the sound of Melissa's voice on that recording. The coldness in her tone, the shameless way she plotted while smiling across my dinner table. And though it hurt, it also reminded me of the truth I had learned long ago in my career. Evil rarely comes in the form of a stranger at the door. More often, it wears the face of someone you thought you knew. But I was not broken by it. Instead, I felt fortified. The strength of a mother does not lie in her ability to avoid pain, but in her capacity to face it, to shield her child, and to stand unyielding when deceit threatens to dismantle what she holds dear. Melissa had underestimated me. She saw only an old woman with silver hair and a quiet home. What she did not see was the investigator who had spent decades dismantling lies, the widow who had survived loss, the mother whose love could not be stolen or deceived. The chapter with Melissa closed, and in its place, Daniel and I found a new rhythm, a quieter, stronger bond forged in the fire of betrayal. Life had stripped away the falsehood, leaving behind only what was real. And that, I realized, was enough. When spring finally settled over Maple Street, the house that had once carried the heaviness of betrayal began to breathe again. The windows, which had felt like watchful eyes during Melissa's stay, now opened freely to let in the warm breeze and the scent of blooming lilacs. I spent mornings tending to my garden, kneeling in the dirt with my hands deep in the soil, feeling the earth's quiet reassurance. Life, no matter how many times it is cut back, always finds a way to grow again. Daniel, too, was changing. The weeks after Melissa's departure had been marked by silence, his grief visible in the slump of his shoulders and the haunted look that sometimes lingered in his eyes. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, light began to return to him. I saw it first when he laughed at a joke on the radio, the sound awkward at first, like a bird relearning how to sing after a storm. I saw it again when he came home one evening with a spark in his eyes, telling me about a new project at the bank that challenged him. He was reclaiming himself, piece by piece, and I watched with quiet pride as he grew stronger in the places he had once been vulnerable. Our conversations shifted too. No longer did we circle around the absence of Melissa, the unspoken weight of what she had done. Instead, we talked about the future, his career, the possibilities of moving into a new apartment, the trips we might take together. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun melt into the horizon, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful look. "Mom," he said softly, "I used to think love was about trusting without question. But I think now it's about trusting wisely, about knowing that real love doesn't hide in shadows or ask for blind faith. It stands in the open." I nodded, my heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. "That's the truth, Daniel. Love is not about closing your eyes. It's about opening them and still choosing to stay." The change in him reminded me of steel, forged in fire, hardened, resilient, yet still shining. He no longer rushed to defend people blindly, but neither had he grown bitter. That balance, I knew, was the mark of maturity. In the quiet moments, I found myself reflecting on my own journey, too. The betrayal had shaken me, but it had not broken me. If anything, it had reminded me that even in the later chapters of life, strength is not something you set aside. It lives within you, waiting to be called upon. My years as an investigator had not been wasted. They had prepared me for this very storm. And my years as a mother had given me the courage to weather it. One Saturday afternoon, as I pruned the roses, Daniel joined me in the garden. He took the shears from my hand and began trimming alongside me, his movements clumsy but earnest. After a while, he paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and said, "You know, Mom, I think Melissa leaving was the best thing that could have happened. I don't feel like a failure anymore. I feel free." His words were a balm to my heart. For so long, I had feared that he would be swallowed by regret, that the betrayal would define him. But here he was, standing in the sunlight, speaking with clarity and strength. In that moment, I realized that the real victory was not in exposing Melissa's lies, but in watching my son rise from the ashes she left behind. The summer that followed was filled with small joys. We hosted barbecues in the backyard, invited neighbors for iced tea, and even took a road trip to the coast. Daniel drove, his laughter mingling with the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I watched him run barefoot along the sand, his arms spread wide like a boy again, and I thought to myself, this is what healing looks like. Not forgetting the pain, but learning to live fully in spite of it. One evening, as the crickets began their chorus and the sky turned deep blue, Daniel turned to me and said, "You saved me, Mom. If it weren't for you, I might still be blind to what she really was." I shook my head gently. "No, Daniel, you saved yourself. I only held the mirror up. You were the one who chose to see." His eyes softened, and for the first time in months, I saw peace settle across his face. Yes, the scars of betrayal remained. Yes, the memory of Melissa's deception still stung when I thought of it too long. But the story was no longer about her. It was about us, about a mother and son who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but tempered, stronger, wiser, closer. And as the stars blinked awake above us that night, I knew we were stepping into a new chapter. As the seasons turned from summer into fall, the rhythm of our lives settled into something calmer, steadier. The leaves on Maple Street blazed into shades of gold and crimson, carpeting the sidewalks with beauty that felt almost deliberate, as though nature herself were reminding us that endings could also be breathtaking beginnings. Daniel had grown quieter in some ways, more thoughtful, but there was a steadiness in him that had not been there before. He began to speak of dreams again, small ones at first, like learning to cook better dinners or saving for a new car. But soon, those dreams grew larger, more vibrant. He spoke of taking courses to expand his career at the bank, of maybe one day buying his own home. His eyes no longer carried the weight of shame, but the light of possibility. Watching him rediscover hope was like watching a wounded bird learn to fly again, wings stronger because they had once been broken. Our bond deepened through the quiet routines of daily life. On cool evenings, we sat by the fireplace sipping cocoa, talking about everything from childhood memories to the books we had recently read. Sometimes, we fell into long silences, the kind that were not empty but full, rich with the comfort of knowing we no longer needed to fill every space with words. I realized that Melissa's betrayal, as painful as it was, had given us something precious. It had forced us to see each other more clearly, not as a mother clinging to her son or a son trying to protect his mother, but as two people walking side by side, equals bound by love and trust. One night, Daniel surprised me with news. He had been offered a promotion at the bank, one that would require more responsibility but also promised a brighter future. He told me about it with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, pacing the kitchen as though the walls themselves needed to hear his plans. I watched him, my heart swelling with pride, and said, "Take it, Daniel. You've earned this. Every storm you've weathered has led you here." He smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile I had not seen in a long time. "I feel like I'm finally standing on my own 2 feet again, Mom. Stronger this time." Not long after, he began spending time with new friends, colleagues who shared his ambitions and values. I met them one evening when they came over for dinner, and I saw in their eyes the respect they held for him. It reassured me to know he was surrounding himself with people who lifted him up rather than pulled him down. And then, slowly, the possibility of new love entered the picture. Daniel did not rush into it. His heart had been bruised too deeply for haste, but he spoke of a woman he had met at the bank, someone kind, grounded, with a quiet humor that reminded him of simpler times. He did not bring her home immediately, but the way he spoke about her, with tenderness and respect, told me more than enough. I did not push. I simply listened, offering him the same patience I had wished for myself in younger years. And though I never said it aloud, I prayed that this time, love would be gentle with him. Meanwhile, I too found renewal in small ways. I joined a local book club, something I had put off for years, and discovered the joy of sitting in a circle of strangers who became friends, each of us trading stories not unlike the ones I carried in my heart. I returned to volunteering at the community center, teaching young mothers how to manage their finances, how to recognize the dangers of debt and deceit. Sharing my knowledge gave me purpose, and watching their eyes widen in understanding reminded me that wisdom, when shared, multiplies. Through all of this, Daniel and I held fast to each other. There were still nights when shadows threatened to creep back, moments when he woke from dreams of Melissa's voice, or when I caught myself checking the locks twice before bed. But those moments grew fewer, and instead of weakening us, they reminded us of how far we had come. One crisp autumn evening, as we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, Daniel turned to me and said, "Mom, I used to think that losing her was the worst thing that could happen to me. But now I realize the worst thing would have been not seeing the truth. You gave me that gift. You gave me my life back." I looked at him then, his face lit by the fading sun, and felt tears prick my eyes. "And you gave me mine back too, Daniel, because a mother's greatest fear is not what the world might take from her, it's losing her child to something she cannot fight. But you came back to me. That's all I'll ever need." The wind rustled the leaves around us, scattering them like pages from an old story. And in that moment, I knew the darkest chapter of our lives had finally closed. What lay ahead was unwritten, but it would be ours to create together with open eyes, steady hearts, and a resilience that could never again be stolen. Yes, Melissa had underestimated me. She had underestimated both of us. But in the end, it was her betrayal that became the fire that forged us stronger. And as the stars began to scatter across the sky above Maple Street, I felt a deep peace settle over me. We had survived. We had healed. And now, at last, we were free. The first frost of winter settled over Maple Street like a quiet blessing. The branches of the maple trees that had once shaded our summers now stood bare, their skeleton silhouettes stretching across the pale sky. Inside the house, warmth glowed from the fireplace, and I sat in my rocking chair with a blanket draped across my lap, reflecting on how far we had come. Life had taken a sharp turn, and yet, here we were still standing, still breathing, still moving forward. Daniel had begun to step into a new chapter of his life with a steadiness that filled me with pride. His promotion at the bank had not only given him responsibility, but also confidence. I watched him grow into the kind of man his father would have been proud of, focused, compassionate, and tempered by wisdom that came only through trial. He was no longer the wide-eyed boy who believed the best of everyone without question. He was still kind, still trusting, but now there was a discernment in him, a careful weighing of words and actions. He had learned, as all of us must, that love without boundaries can be dangerous. In December, he introduced me to Claire, the woman he had spoken of so cautiously at first. She came into the house carrying a plate of homemade cookies, her smile gentle, her presence unassuming. There was no flashiness about her, no calculated charm. Instead, she exuded a quiet strength, the kind that does not need to be announced. Watching her laugh softly with Daniel in the kitchen, I felt a sense of ease wash over me. She was not a replacement for the scars of the past, but rather a reminder that not every story of love ends in betrayal. I did not pry into their relationship. Instead, I let it unfold naturally, watching Daniel find joy again in the small gestures, sharing coffee in the morning, cooking dinner together, walking hand in hand down the street. Sometimes, I caught him looking at her with an expression I had not seen in years, one of genuine contentment. And though my heart had been hardened once by Melissa's deceit, I allowed myself to hope again, for his sake. For myself, I began to embrace the reality of aging not as a decline, but as a vantage point. At 68 years old, I had seen enough to know that life is not measured by how many years we avoid pain, but by how many times we rise after falling. Each wrinkle etched into my face carried a story, and each silver strand of hair was a thread of survival. I was no longer afraid of being underestimated. If anything, I found strength in it. Let the world see me as fragile. I knew the steel that lived beneath my skin. On quiet evenings, I often thought of Thomas, my late husband. I imagined how he would have guided Daniel through this storm, how he would have stood beside me as we confronted Melissa. Sometimes, I felt his presence in the stillness, a whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I spoke to him in the silence, thanking him for the lessons we had shared, promising him that our son was finding his way again. Grief never truly disappears, but it becomes a softer companion with time. Daniel and I also found new ways to give back. We began volunteering at the community center together. He taught financial literacy classes while I mentored women struggling with debt. It felt poetic, in a way, that the very tools Melissa had once tried to exploit became the foundation for helping others. Watching my son stand before a group of young people, teaching them how to build trust wisely, I felt a surge of pride that nearly brought me to tears. There were moments, of course, when memories of Melissa resurfaced. Betrayal does not vanish easily. Sometimes, I saw a shadow of her in the corner of my mind, heard her whispering voice plotting in the dark. But instead of fear or anger, I felt only resolve. She no longer had power over us. She had chosen deceit, and in doing so, she had lost everything. One snowy evening, Daniel sat with me by the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I understand now. Love isn't about blind trust. It's about trust that is earned, day by day. And you showed me that. You showed me what real loyalty looks like." I placed my hand on his, squeezing gently. "And you showed me resilience, Daniel. You walked through fire and came out stronger. That's all any mother could ask for." We sat in silence after that, the crackling fire speaking for us. In that moment, I felt the weight of everything we had endured lift, replaced by a sense of peace I had not felt in years. The new year arrived quietly, with fireworks blooming over the town and neighbors cheering in the streets. As Daniel and Claire stood together on the porch, watching the sparks paint the sky, I stayed back inside, watching them through the window. My heart swelled with gratitude. Life had tested us, yes, but it had also given us a second chance. I realized then that the story was never about Melissa's betrayal. It was about what came after the healing, the growth, the bond between mother and son that no deceit could destroy. It was about justice, yes, but also about mercy. The mercy we showed ourselves when we chose to keep living fully despite the wounds. And so, as the clock struck midnight and the world embraced another year, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for my son, for the strength that had carried us, for the love that had endured, for the truth that had set us free. As I sit here now, with the warmth of the fire beside me and the steady rhythm of my rocking chair creaking against the old wooden floor, I find myself reflecting on what this journey has truly meant. People often think betrayal is the end of a story, that once trust is shattered, there is nothing left but pieces too sharp to hold. But I have learned something different. Betrayal is not the end. It is a test. It strips away illusions. It reveals who we are when the mask of comfort is torn from us, and it leaves behind the raw truth of character. Melissa thought she had fooled me. She believed that age made me blind, that my kindness meant naivety, and that love for my son would silence my instincts. But she underestimated the most powerful truth of all. A mother's eyes never close, and a mother's love cannot be deceived for long. What she failed to see is that mothers carry within them a strength born of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of battles fought quietly for their children's futures. That strength is not loud, but it is unbreakable. To those listening, I want you to remember this: kindness has limits, and trust must be given wisely. Love is not blind, it is vigilant. It sees the truth, even when the truth is painful. And above all, never mistake age for weakness. The people you assume are fragile may carry more resilience, more wisdom, and more fight than you could ever imagine. Daniel and I emerged from this storm not as victims, but as survivors. Stronger, wiser, closer. And if you have ever been betrayed, if someone has ever tried to rob you of your peace, your dignity, or your love, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not powerless. You are not broken. You are still capable of rising, of protecting what is yours, and of writing the next chapter of your story with courage. So let this be a reminder. From one mother's heart to yours, never underestimate yourself, and never, ever forget that the love you carry, though quiet, is the most powerful weapon of all. If this story touched you, if you believe in the strength of mothers and in the justice of truth revealed, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share this channel with others. Together, let us keep telling these stories so no one forgets the unshakable power of a mother's love.